In the 1970s, an architect bought a small house on a quiet suburban street in Santa Monica, California. To fit the needs of his growing family, he designed and built an extension to that house. But he was working with a small budget, which pushed the limits of his creativity. The design he created, a Cubist massing of glass, chain link, and corrugated metal, shocked the neighbors. One even sued him over the addition, calling it an eyesore. That architect was future Pritzker Prize winner Frank Gehry, who would go on to become one of the most influential and original architects in the world. And although his career is punctuated by soaring designs on a grand scale all around the globe, it was this small personal project that was the catalyst for the most iconic phase of his career. I'm Michael Wyetzner. I've been an architect for over 35 years. And today we're going to look at the personal home of Frank Gehry. So this is the home that Frank Gehry purchased in Santa Monica, California in 1977. It's a Dutch Colonial house originally built in 1920 on a quiet suburban street. And you can see here in this photograph that they're just starting to build the extension. And this is the extension that Gehry designed, which was completed 1 year later in 1978. Somewhat understandably, this shocked the neighbors. They really weren't sure what they were looking at. But the world of architecture was very impressed. At this point in Gehry's life, he had already been working as an architect for more than 20 years. And he was nearly 50 years old when this extension was completed. Most of his work to this point had been the modernist tradition, closer to the Bauhaus or Corbusier. But this was something entirely new. Gehry was always interested in art and hung around with artists a lot. Larry Bell, Ron Davis, Lou Danziger, and even did some houses and studios for them. So it was during this project that he resolved to reinvent himself and become more of an artist architect. And this is really the moment when the career he became known for began. So let's take a look at this extension. And the first thing that jumps out at me is how he used these very raw, industrial-like materials. So he's got corrugated metal, and he's got plywood, and he's got exposed wood studs, and he has chain link and concrete block. And so this is the house when it's completed. It's not under construction. But what Gehry was trying to do was to convey the excitement of projects that are under construction. And so he's using these materials that you would normally see on a job site that eventually get covered up. So it wasn't only the idea of echoing construction. He was also using these raw industrial materials like an artist might use it. He's manipulating them and changing the way they appear. He's playing with the angles. He's playing with the idea of different shapes and forms. So for instance, the studs you see here, those are not how you typically see them. Same with the corrugated metal, how he cuts it out in this way, almost as if it's creating an optical illusion, as if it's bent, but it's actually not. In fact, talking about the materials on this house, Gehry even said, I found the materials that people hated the most and used the most. So I was going to try and see if I could play with it sculpturally. Gehry also spoke about how he was inspired by Rauschenberg and Johns and the way that both of those artists used common materials as part of their art making. Specifically Rauschenberg and his combines, as he was taking these discarded materials, incorporating them into his pieces. So manipulating materials always fascinated Gehry, especially inexpensive materials that could be mass-produced. Starting in the 1960s, he had been experimenting with furniture made out of a variety of materials, including corrugated cardboard. His first furniture line was called Easy Edges and included the famous Wiggles side chair, which had all these beautiful, curvy, undulating lines. In the 1980s, he would turn his experiments to plastic. He created his iconic fish lamps using a plastic laminate called Color Core by Formica. These lamps had jagged scales layered like actual fish scales to control and reveal the light within. And this idea of scales or shingles, he would revisit many times later in his career. But whatever material Gehry had at hand, he would always try to manipulate it to create something new from it. And you can clearly see that in both his furniture and this house. And another great example of this is at the Weissman Art Museum at the University of Minnesota. And it was built in 1993, and it sits on the banks of the Mississippi River. So as you can see in this image, he's using two primary materials. He's using this stainless steel cladding on these very cubist forms here in the middle. And then in the background, believe it or not, this brick is part of the same building. So what I really like about this is you can almost picture this as if it were a flat facade with these windows all in a row. But what he's doing is he's portraying it as if it's reflected in the river with all its ripples and surface movement. So what he's doing is he's representing the river, but also the material he's using is actually reflecting the river at the same time. So if we look at a close-up, you could see Gehry's doing something. He's using a really thin version of the material so that it oil cans, which is a term for means it basically wrinkles. And by doing that, he gets even more reflection. It makes it feel more like water than if he had used a thicker material. So even in this still photograph, it almost looks like it's in motion. So the other thing he was able to do with this thin sheet stainless steel is that he's able to create these sinuous, undulating curves. And so by creating these forms, the other thing he does is he creates these multiple views of the river from within by breaking down this facade. So if this was all a flat facade, you would never get views of the river that you get from like a window here, looking all the way down. So it's a great example of him experimenting with a material that goes beyond its typical application. This is certainly not the most famous building to utilize Gehry's experimentation with curved metal. Perhaps none was more important than the Guggenheim Bilbao, which changed the fortunes of an entire city. That building, and therefore Gehry, is credited with creating the Bilbao effect. So the Bilbao effect essentially is where these post-industrial cities, which had hit hard times, can be revitalized by hiring a signature architect to do a signature building. So Gehry loved these curvilinear and sculptural forms, and his adoption of technology allowed him to go even further with them. Around the same time he was designing the Wyetzner Museum, he designed another fish sculpture. This time, it was a massive installation of a piece for the 1992 Olympics in Barcelona. Gehry always preferred using models to design as opposed to starting with two-dimensional drawings. He liked being able to spontaneously manipulate and tinker with the materials in real time while he was working on these models. But this process led to some forms that were hard to describe in traditional two-dimensional drawings. And so he adopted the use of a program called CATIA, which is an acronym for Computer-Aided Three-Dimensional Application, which was used by the French military originally. The software was originally used for designing airplanes, boats and cars that involved lots of curves and required very precise measurements. So it was perfect for Gehry's need to translate scale models with unique shapes into plans that could actually be built. And while the Guggenheim Bilbao and Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles utilize a similar style to this waterfront facade of the Weissman Art Museum, there's another aspect to this building that tells us more about the way Gehry thought about design. So this is another view of the Weissman Museum. And what's really great about this is now that you can see these very quiet zones. So he's juxtaposing this very noisy against this very quiet. So he has this really active facade that sits on the river, which is doing all these crazy things with the forms. And then he juxtaposes that against this very simple, unadorned, windowless brick facade, which is really quite a contrast. And quite often, those quiet moments are actually taken from the context of where the building is. So what he's done is this metal facade is within the context of the river, and then this brick facade is in the context of the city behind. It's spanning through design and its use of materials from the river to the city. The other thing he does with these really quiet moments is he's just containing pure functions. For instance, in this case, there's a parking garage on these lower levels, and then above it are museum galleries that have skylights above. So Gehry has said, he was so interested in the container, that the container was a place for function, that buildings have to work, that they have to fulfill certain programmatic needs. And if he didn't do that, it was a failure. But at the same time, he wanted to take these containers and make them as interesting and sculptural as he possibly could. And you could see that idea that he applied throughout his entire career right here in his own house. So these are the plans of Frank Gehry's house that he devised for the extension. And you could see the original house here with its bay window at the living room and its windows along the back. And then this is the upper level here, and the original house is there. And what I find really remarkable about these drawings is that when you look at what his addition, it looks very sort of plain, mundane almost. But then if you look at it in 3 dimensions, all of a sudden you see something totally different. in that he's taking these forms and he's tilting them and twisting them and making them look as if they crash, which you have no indication when you're just looking at the plan. So in fact, what he's doing is he's maximizing the square footage, and the most efficient way to do that is with this outer rectangle that he's putting around the existing house. Because really, he wants more square feet. He needs a bigger house, and he wants to maximize it. He's really fulfilling the function of the house, but he's doing it in a way that he takes these elements and twists them and carves them and makes them something completely different. And in this case, at the Wyetzner, he wanted to take these containers to enclose these programmatic needs and make them as interesting and sculptural as he possibly could. And he clearly does that here, juxtaposing this very noisy against this very quiet. So this idea of noisy versus quiet was also explored at his house in Santa Monica. So he's got this big facade of the corrugated metal again, with this slight roof on it. But then in the middle of it, he breaks it apart and he creates this Cubist form that sort of is dropped into it in this very noisy way. And he gives you this glimpse back to the house beyond. So he's got this really calm sort of frame. And then beyond it, he breaks it and creates this really jumble, noisy zone. So when you have these moments of quiet and noisy, at some point, they collide with each other and form these collisions that he was very interested in exploring. So this is an image of the kitchen in his house. So this represents collision in a number of ways. So in one way, it's the collision of the new versus the old. When he built this extension, he left the original facades of the house intact. And you could see that clearly here inside the kitchen, which is right here. So you could see the original house here, and then how these other forms and pieces collide into it. And then he built the kitchen on the driveway and even keeps the asphalt on the floor to express that idea. But the other thing he does, and you can see that quite clearly here, is that he takes these forms and this line and he smashes through it with this big form of a skylight, which is essentially what it is. So from both the outside and the inside, you get the impression of this glass cube that just crash landed into this house. From this example, you could really see how interested Gehry was in this idea of collision. Collision of materials, collision of forms, collision of ideas. And he likened it to people colliding at a party and what happens, and the spontaneity inherent in that sort of situation. And we can really see this in another project he did in Prague. So this is the dancing house in Prague, also known as Ginger and Fred, because it appears like two partners dancing. And Gehry also had a partner in designing this building. Vlado Milanic had landed the gig to design the building, and he invited Gehry to collaborate on the design. He's exploring the idea of collision again here. So he's colliding two different materials, but he's also colliding two different forms. And the other thing he's doing is he's also expressing the river in this building. This sits on the Vltava in Prague, but he's doing it in a different way than he did it at the Wyetzner in Minnesota on the Mississippi. So you could see in this photo quite clearly that it sits along the river, and you could see the context very clearly. So in a sense, this building looks like it's colliding with its context, but at the same time is growing out of the context. He's taking this rhythm of the turrets that you see here, of these domes and their finials, and then he lands it here on this cylindrical form, and then that cylindrical form then collides with this glass form, which becomes sort of the ending of these turrets. So that you can read it as going from the traditional architecture all the way to this modernist idea of this glass form here as it moves down the block. And this really gets at another idea that Gehry experimented with, and that we can see clearly here, is this idea of movement. After all, it wouldn't be a dancing house if it didn't evoke movement. I love this series of columns he puts at the base of it, almost as if they're legs, but they look like they're legs that are in movement because he repeats it so many times. But the other thing he does that I find really fascinating is because of this bay window, they're out of phase, and he brings that out of phase idea onto the facade of the main building. He's taking the windows, which almost look as if they're just floating along on the river, as if they're undulating on the surface. He brings that rising and falling, and it also expresses the idea of the river and just bobbing along the river in a very, very sort of gentle way. And the other thing he's doing is he's got these lines that he uses, almost as if he shingled. They almost read like the waves in the river, the way the water flows. And he does the same thing. He continues those lines into the glass on the ginger portion of the building. And you can also see this idea of movement back in Santa Monica. So the way he does it in Santa Monica is in a different way. And what he does there is he takes this parallel plane to the house of the corrugated metal, but at the same time, he's creating this false perspective where this end is much taller than this end. And that creates an illusion as if this plane is at a severe angle to the house. And so it creates this illusion of depth, like parallel lines disappearing into the distance. And then the other thing he does is he takes the context and then he has this movement or this transition into a modern piece. And he does it even here on the windows. Well, the original house is the context that he's playing off of. So you could see the windows on the original house, and you could see them just barely in here through the dining room over here. The original house had these small mullions that sit on top of this larger, more traditional window. And then he juxtaposes that with these big cutout windows. And even here, he goes even further with this big sort of 3D Cubist window. So again, it's this idea of this movement from traditional to modern as he does here. While materiality, context, collision, and movement are all prominent ideas in Gehry's work, he was also very interested in a lot of the ideas set forth in Cubism. In fact, in the documentary sketches of Frank Gehry, the architect said that when he purchased the house, he was told it had ghosts, and he decided they were ghosts of Cubism. So one of the elements of Cubism is that, you see an object from multiple points of view at the same time. And it also deconstructs and reassembles them. And there's a lot of examples of that in his house here in Santa Monica. So the first thing is he takes this skylight that we had looked at earlier and he tilts it up so that you get to see both sides of the pitched roof and you also get to see the gable all at the same time. And then the other thing he does is he does the same thing with this window at the corner of the kitchen and dining room, in that you see through it and you can see the roof of that piece at the same time that you're looking at these two sides of the same three-dimensional object. And then he also skews the angle of it so that it appears to be distorted. And at the same time, he's pulling these things apart and then putting them back together in a different way with all the pieces. So the whole thing reads as a Cubist collage. Okay, so let's take a look at how Cubism is manifested in another one of his more famous works. This is the Status Center at MIT, and it was completed in 2004. And so what I love about this image is just if you look at this metal-clad building, this stainless steel building, you see how he's taken what would appear to be, in any other context, just a regular metal-clad building, but he's bent it and he's distorted it and he's twisted it, and all of a sudden it becomes as if it's part of a Cubist painting. And then he takes another piece here, this brick piece, that in a sense almost feels like an object in its own right. So it's almost as if he took a very conventional rectangular building, but then he multiplies it, he facets it, and so he shows you all the corners at the same time. The other thing he does here is, so it's this great collage of different forms and multiple buildings. It's almost like he's creating his own city, and in a sense, that's what he did. So you've got the brick building, you've got the metal building, you've got the yellow building, you've got this different kind of brick building, you've got a titanium building, and they're all working together as one sort of great collage. So he's contrasting all sorts of different things. in this one place. Colorful and muted, and he's contrasting brick and metal, and he's contrasting curves and rectilinear here and here and here and here. And he creates this entire city in the middle of the MIT campus. So all these ideas that we just talked about are what make Gehry's work so exciting and so unique. And you could see all of their origins in his personal house here in Santa Monica. Frank Gehry sadly passed away in 2025. But over the course of more than 60 years of practicing architecture, his impact on the world is undeniable. From creating sculptural buildings that inspire and amaze, to revolutionizing the way architects utilize technology. He was truly an original. So what's your favorite Frank Gehry building? Let us know in the comments below.